Better turn the mic on. I'm out of practice. We want to welcome everyone here. Welcome everyone to the Southern RAC. It's exciting to be live again. This feels good. So hopefully we keep this up. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's do introductions. If we could start down there with you, Chad, and just your name, where you're from, and who you represent.
Chad Utley from St. George, representing public at large.
Nick Jorgensen from St. George, representing non-consumptives.
Chuck Chamberlain from Cedar City with the Forest Service.
Austin Atkinson, Cedar City, Utah, representing public at large.
Greg Lobb from Burrell, representing agriculture.
Dean Boardman Hinckley, representing the public at large.
Berlin King from Bicknell, representing agriculture.
And I'm Braden Richmond from Beaver. I represent sportsmen, and then I also serve as the chair on the Southern RAC. So, just a couple reminders on the RAC procedure. It's been so long since we've had public here. Just a quick reminder. What we'll do is we'll go over each agenda item with this new process. It's been great. The plan is, even though we're back to live sessions, we'll continue to share the proposals online so people have a chance to view those ahead of time. We really appreciate the division doing that. That's going to help these meetings a lot, I believe. So what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions from the public, then we'll do questions from the RAC, and then we'll do discussion. So that'll be kind of the general procedure as we go along. So with that said, let's jump into item number 2. We need to approve the agenda and the minutes. If anyone wants to make a motion there.
I'll motion that we approve the agenda and the minutes.
Man, I was worried we weren't going to get a motion for a minute. Thank you. Do we have a second on that?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Passed unanimous. Thank you. Wildlife board meeting update. Let me just go through that item by item. Again, a fairly big wildlife board meeting. So we had a motion. Let me get down to the right spot here. So it was the waterfowl rule amendment. So there was a motion made by Randy Dirth that failed for the lack of a second. The motion was that we approve the division's recommendations as presented, with the caveat we form a working group to get together and bring information back to the board. There was another motion by Carl Hurst, seconded by Brent Selman, that passed, and that was to move that the division establish a special use permit for the guided waterfowl hunting on waterfowl management areas for the 2021 season, and that guides who guide on WMAs in Utah would need to apply for this permit. There was another motion made by Carl Hurst, seconded by Wade Heaton, that passed unanimous. They moved to form a working group to establish guiding rules and regulations and licensing waterfowl guides in the state of Utah. Another motion was made by Kevin Albrecht and seconded by Donnie Hunter that passed unanimous. That motion was to accept the remainder of the division's recommendations as presented. The next action item was the electronic meeting rules and amendments. And there was a motion made by Donnie Hunter and seconded by Randy Dirth that passed unanimous. That was to accept the division's rule amendments as presented. Next was conservation permit list, the 3-year permits. There was a motion made by Carl Hurst and seconded by Brent Selman, and that passed unanimous. And that motion was to approve the conservation tag allocations as presented. Next agenda item was the advisory committee vacancies. There was a motion by Randy Dirth and Kevin Albrecht that passed unanimous. The motion was to accept the CWMU committee as presented. Next agenda item was the Parker Sagegrass hunt closures. Motion made by Wade Heaton, seconded by Kevin Albrecht, passed unanimously. The motion was to approve the Parker Sagegrass hunt closure as presented. The other business was the election of a chair and the vice chair. So the following motion was made by Byron Bateman, seconded by Randy Dirth, passed unanimous, that Kevin Albrecht would serve as the Wildlife Board chair. And then a second motion made by Byron, seconded by Wade Heaton, that Randy Dirth would serve as the vice chair. So there's all the minutes and motions from the last Wildlife Board meeting. Any questions on that or any comments there anyone has? Okay. With that, I'll turn it over to Kevin to go over updates.
Before you do that, you've got Wade, and you've got Dan Fletcher online if you want to give them a chance to introduce.
Great. Wade and Dan, do you want to jump on and introduce yourself? I got to get used to this online thing now. I'm so excited to be in person, but will you introduce yourself online here?
Yeah, I'm Dan Fletcher, Cedar City, BLM. Sorry I'm not there in person. I got a sick kid I'm tending to tonight.
No problem, Dan. That's exactly why we're doing this format. So it's great that you're there, and I'll just have to probably be reminded once or twice to get your vote as we go along. Wade, are you there?
You talking to me, Braden, Wade Heaton?
The one and only.
Okay. Well, there's a few Wades around now. Anyway, just listening in. Appreciate all you guys are doing.
Thanks, Wade. We appreciate you having here representing the Wildlife Board. So thank you for being here. With that, I'll turn it over to Kevin for the regional update.
Okay. Thank you, Braden. First, let's talk about the kind of the habitat conditions and what we've got going on. Certainly the rains are helping that we've been getting. Our upper elevations look pretty good, and everything above about 7,000, 7,500 feet as I've been around the region is in pretty good shape. From there, going down in elevation, it kind of gets less and less good the lower you go. Our lowest elevations haven't shown any response to the rain until that last really 4 or 5 days. We finally started to see some green up. As I have driven around the region, I would say they kind of look like they would in May instead of in August. Just kind of starting to show some growth. A lot of those ranges didn't even germinate earlier in the year. So things are getting better, but they're still not great. I guess the bottom line is we'll take the rain, but you don't end 2 years of drought with 3 weeks of rain. And so, it's been good, but we need more. I guess I'd ask our BLM and Forest Service reps if they have anything they'd like to add to that in terms of what it looks like on the mountain, Chuck, and what you're hearing.
Yeah, things are looking better, but we've had some of our water stations have recorded 400% of normal for the month of July. So it's brought us from 55% in the water year to 75%, which is great. Most of that water has just come right off the mountain. It's not infiltrating like it should. So the filtration rates are low. And so we're still behind. It takes snowpack to catch up to what we need. So we're still waiting.
Yeah. Thank you. And Dan, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would second everything that's been said. Our higher elevations are starting to come on with a little bit of green up. The lower elevations are still suffering. We didn't have any green up at all in a lot of cases. And the rain out in the West Desert has been fast, and we've had some severe erosion and runoff in a lot of areas. But we'll take the rain when we can get it, and hopefully we get a good snowpack so we can start catching up here.
Okay, thank you. And then also our ag reps, Verland and or Craig, anything you'd like to add just in terms of what you're hearing from the agricultural perspective in terms of where we're at in drought versus where we have been and what we still need?
As far as farmers, it's kind of a catch-22. The rain is good and we love it, but some of us been struggling to put up hay too. And so that's been the downside of it.
Yeah, over in Wayne County, we don't put up much hay, so my prayers were answered for praying for black hay. We got 2 inches of rain the day before yesterday, so I had to put my sprinkler system back together. But it has really helped the range. Like they said, it looks like May. It's the first time on record that the cows are eating at the same time as the elk. I knew there'd be something in there somewhere.
Up on the Southwest Desert, on my side of it, we just didn't get any rain.
You're still. still struggling hard. I haven't been out west much, but that's good to know. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, let's move on. Continuing kind of with our habitat section, but in a different realm, we closed all of our wildlife management areas to any sort of open flames following the restrictions that were in place in the rest of the state. We also closed the Fillmore shooting range because we actually had a fire that was started by target shooting up there. We think we're in a place we've gone and done some mitigation and removed some vegetation, and then that combined with the moisture, we're hoping to reopen the Fillmore shooting range this Friday. And so that'll provide a place for folks up there around Fillmore to go again. In our aquatic section, water levels are still really low. I drove past both Otter Creek and Coucherum reservoirs today. Otter Creek is maybe holding steady at a low level right now with the rain. Coucherum's dry. There's no water in Coucherum reservoir at all. We'll stick with our regulation changes on all of our reservoirs. I think they're scheduled to go through either end of September or end of October. We're still going to be in a situation where fish populations are going to struggle. I know Minersville Reservoir has been rediscovered by lots of people now that they can fish with bait for a little bit. And I'm glad people have had a chance to take advantage of that. It will take us time to rebuild those fisheries. It's not going to happen overnight. It'll be 3 to 5 years of good water conditions to get some of those fisheries back. And that's just the reality of what it's going to take. So last thing on aquatics, we're trying to schedule a public meeting to discuss a treatment up at Navajo, rotenone treatment to kind of reset that lake. It's been overtaken by Utah chubs. So we're reaching out to the folks up in Duck Creek and around. We have visited with both the Iron County and Kanab County commissions. They're both fully supportive of us taking that, but we want to just make sure we're including the public and getting comment back on that. That hasn't been scheduled yet, but it'll be upcoming in the next couple of weeks. Wildlife section's is in the middle of their elk classifications right now. Cow to calf ratios are low, like as we would expect with just kind of poor condition of the adults coming off the range. As the information we're getting from all of our callers is our fawn to doe ratios, our fawn survival is going to be pretty low as well. So we're going to be, again, just like it's going to take 3 to 5 years to rebuild of good moisture to rebuild a fish population in a lake. It's going to take the same of good moisture conditions to rebuild our deer populations. So we'll keep monitoring that and doing what we can to mitigate those impacts. As in most dry years, we've dealt with a number of bears around the region. Haven't had any real serious issues, but we've captured a few bears and dealt with them. Been moving some nuisance beavers around to places where people don't want them to places where they can do some good up in higher elevations. And then just moving on to our law enforcement, we're currently down 6 officers in our region, 6 out of what's our total? 11. So we're at less than half capacity in our law enforcement. And we've had a number of officers that have accepted promotions, which we're thrilled for them, but we're short-staffed right now. And so I hope people will be understanding. There'll be some longer response times than what folks are used to. That's all I've got for an update. Unless there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer any. Okay, thank you, Braden.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Let's move on. We have the first agenda item is the fur bear and bobcat harvest recommendation, and then after that, we'll go into the cougars. So we'll start with the bobcat harvest recommendations. It's been so long since I've done this. Questions from the RAC or public first? I think I said public first, but I'm thinking it's the RAC first. Right?
Yeah, questions from the RAC and then questions from the public, and then I'll do the summary of online comments, and then we'll go from there.
Got to get back in the flow. All right, questions from the RAC on the bobcat.
Do we have any printout stuff? Because usually I'm cheating with.
You're trying to remember what's going on. I didn't know, Tammy. I didn't bring anything. Sorry.
We'll have that conversation at the end as we transition back let us know what you want. We didn't print anything out. We haven't been doing it while we've been online.
Yeah.
But we'll do what you want us to do. We don't have much for you today, though.
I can certainly summarize, Tammy, if so. Most of the fur bear stuff is the same. We changed the dates for the year. For bobcats, we've seen a couple of metrics come back within compliance of the plan. So we're recommending extending the season an additional week on the front end, which is not a full season. It's a week shorter. Going ahead and allowing individuals to go back to 6 permits per person, and removing the cap. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
If the plan is statewide,
Mhm.
and the bobcat situation looks pretty good statewide, but I'm wondering about the southern region because we've cut back everything else because of drought. I'm wondering if that's hurt. the bobcats
It seems like there are two things that drive bobcat harvest. One is small mammal population. So as those cycle, we'd expect to see a response in bobcats. Talking to our upland game coordinator, they do things like rabbit routes, and that's been down. It's up a little bit, so that could contribute to it. We saw a lot of juveniles in the harvest, juvenile bobcats, which indicates to us statewide that there's been a birth pulse and that there's young that have been produced. So we look at it every year. In a perfect world, we'd have some kind of population metric, but we do the best we can with we can't go out and count bobcats, and so we have to use what we have, and that's what the plan prescribes. So it's certainly within the plan guidelines. And the other thing that drives population harvest is pelt price. It's when pelt price is up, people take a lot, and when pelt price is down, they tend to not take so much. So those two things really are the drivers.
Quick question, Darren, on how fast has that permit cap been selling out, like in years past?
That's a good question. I'd probably have to get back to you on that.
Just roughly.
I think it goes pretty quick. I mean, people jump in line, and it does obviously sell out. So people get in and get what they can. A lot of times, when you limit the numbers an individual can get, then a lot of people in the family suddenly become interested in trapping, and so those permits go.
Denise and Alyssa, do you guys remember from last year how quickly did we sell out of bobcat permits?
Oh, I think they did go quick.
They went quick.
Can't remember if it was a couple of weeks or.
I'd say maybe a week or so.
Okay, so best guess a week or so.
About a week.
I had a question on the cap. Have we ever just taken the cap off before?
Yeah, we just put the cap in place a couple of years ago. Again, according to the plan guidelines, we had all our metrics outside of our management objectives. And so those are some of the remedies that we use. And for most of the duration of the plan, there hasn't been a cap. I think this is the first time do you remember, Kevin, ever reducing a cap after the new bobcat? I don't remember. It would have been after Leslie. So
the bobcat plan is really prescriptive on that, Chuck. And so it outlines when there's a cap and when there isn't, based on how many metrics are inside or outside of normal. And so we followed it when we needed to put the cap on according to the plan. We put it on. We're out now. Those metrics are in line with kind of those normal ranges, and so the plan would prescribe that it comes off. So that's what our recommendation is.
Yeah. So the plan has a baseline, which is a season length, and no cap, and 6 permits per individual. And that's kind of where we try to maintain. But obviously, if we see negative metrics, we reduce.
Okay, so we have a pretty good feel for what's going to happen if we take the cap off. Then we're not going to see.
We'll see a lot of permits, and then we'll just have to watch it. But we look at bobcats every year, so if it looks like we took a lot of bobcats and pelt prices are up, then we'll come back with a different recommendation.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Good questions. Any additional questions? Okay, we take questions from the public. As you come up, just please state your name and then question. No questions from the public. Kevin, do you want to summarize the input we got?
Yeah, this one will be, this one is really easy. We had no public comments on fur bear and bobcat recommendations.
Pretty easy. All right, comments from the public.
We don't have any comment cards for this agenda.
Okay, we don't have any cards, so we'll assume there's no comments. There's only a few people here, so if someone wants to jump up, we'd let you, but we'll keep moving along. Discussion from the RAC. Comments and discussion from the RAC. Man, the questions must have solved all the concerns, so.
But, you know, that we should take time to deliberate the question.
Sounds good. Well, if there's no comments, we'd entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion that we accept the recommendations.
So we have a motion from Tammy and a second from Berlin. Sorry. Any additional discussion we need? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Just a reminder, as we go back live, keep your hands up long enough they can count them. But if it's unanimous, it's easy. Oh, Dan, sorry. Thank you. I knew I was going to forget him. We only have one other item tonight too, and I'll probably forget that one. Dan, in favor or opposed?
In favor. Aye.
Thanks, Dan. Unanimous. Okay, on to the next one, Cougar recommendations and rules. So again, we'll start with questions from the RAC.
And if it's all right with the chair and the RAC, I think, we've had a couple meetings, and I think if I could maybe run through predator management plans a little bit, and that might be helpful to our discussion. So
Yeah, that would be
that's all
great.
right. Okay.
Darren, also, I was going to ask you in the Central RAC, as I was watching that, you described why you felt like it wasn't appropriate to reconvene the Cougar Committee at this time, even though with the legislative changes. I think that'd be great to cover
Sure.
right now, too.
I
I
can
thought your
cover that, too.
explanation was really good.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do both. First of all, I think there's some confusion about in the presentation. I kind of went through the process or why predator management plans are a thing, and the recent legislation that requires the director to take immediate action if we see ungulate populations failing to meet objectives. But I think there's a little bit of gray or some confusion about, well, how do these plans get implemented and when do they cease to be in effect? So I thought maybe I'd take just a minute and kind of walk through that. We do have a policy. So when the legislature acted, one of the caveats in the language is that the division needs to determine if predators are causing or contributing to the decline in those ungulate populations. And so we went to the literature and put our heads together and developed a policy to try to determine when that was the case. I'm going to focus on deer. Predator management plans do include the possibility of elk populations and certainly bighorn sheep populations. But most of the time we're talking about deer objectives. So I'll stick to that. And if anyone has questions about sheep or something, I'm happy to go into that. There's really two instances when we would recommend a predator management plan for a deer herd that's failing to meet objectives. One is fairly obvious, and that is where we see cause-specific mortality from cougars at a high level. A good example of that is the manti. In recent years, we've seen, so we have collars on a lot of deer throughout the state. So we go and examine those animals when they die and try to determine the cause of death. The manti, we were saying 20 to 30% cougar mortality on adult does, and overall doe survival was like 79%, if I remember right, in the 70s, and that's unusual. We also saw deer that were in really good body condition, so they weren't limited by habitat. It looked like a predator, a top-down predator caused suppression of that herd. And so in that case, we implemented predator management plans to try to reduce the density of cougars on those manti units in order to let that deer herd recover. It's been 1 year, but we have seen that that cause-specific mortality jumped to, or decreased. So now we're seeing about 97% adult deer survival on the Manti. And that's after 1 year of predator management. Keep in mind, we had fairly high quotas on the Manti prior to that too. So we've been working the problem. But that's an example of cause specific. So you'd want to go in because you can see that cougars are killing a lot of you, especially adults, but even young as well. The second instance is what we're experiencing in a lot of the state right now, and that is where some environmental factor, a drought, causes those mule deer populations that were a fairly high level and maybe even approaching what the range could sustain, crash because of some short duration, 2 or 3 years of it could be winter, in this case, drought, especially in the southern part of the state. What happens is you have a high level of prey animals supporting a level of predators, and they're kind of in sync, but then you lose your prey, and that predator population eventually will decline, but it doesn't decline right away. And so you're carrying a high level of predators on the range, and they can exert an increased amount of pressure on a deer herd that's already crashed or significantly declined. The literature also shows that if a deer population is significantly below the carrying capacity of the habitat, that's really when predators can have the most effect. Once they get close to what the range can sustain, then other things would kill them. If a cougar didn't eat them, then they'd starve to death in the winter. So it becomes less effective. So in those cases, what we're trying to do is reduce the density of predators, bring those two populations more in line, and then kind of let them move on from there. So that's how those are a couple instances of how these plans are implemented. Now, how do we get out? When do we determine if a plan has done what we want it to do? First of all, typically 1 year isn't enough. So we generally plan to run these plans for 3 years. We evaluate them twice a year, though. We look at them in July and we look at them again in December, and try to see if, first of all, are we having the desired effect on the predator population? And generally, we'd want to see females in the harvest above 40% to see a decline in overall predator or cougar populations. The second thing we look at is what's the mule deer herd doing? So if we got into it, the Manti is another good example of this. We had in the 70s adult deer survival. We're seeing that come up. It's 97%. It's 1 year, so we'd want to see how that plays out. But if that remains the case, then that would be a unit you could argue ought to come out of predator management. It looks like we've dealt with the problem. This has all to do with big game populations for things like depredation. That's another issue I'd be happy to talk about. But predator management plans are focused on those ungulate wild populations. So hopefully that's helpful. And I don't know, we'll talk more about it because we've got some proposals tonight. The only other thing I'd add is predator management plans are a director action. So those, he's required to act immediately when we see these things. And so that's something that the RACs don't get to vote on, and the board doesn't vote on because the director does that under his authority. So we inform the RACs of what's going on, but it's not something that's an action item typically.
Darren,
You wanted-
and to clarify, that's because that's the way the legislation
Right.
set it up.
Yeah.
They're not a choice that we've made. That's
Right.
the way what we've
Yeah.
been directed to do by the legislature.
Right. So obviously I'll be happy to answer any more questions that arise because I know it'll be a topic of discussion, but I just wanted to maybe clarify that. I think it was a little bit of a black box based on the discussions we've had at the last couple of meetings. So as far as the plan goes, we did need to do a review of the Cougar plan. It sunsets in 2025, but 5 years prior to the sunset, the plan calls for a review. In light of the legislative changes, we took a look internally to try to determine if we needed to have a committee come back together. We felt like we did need to make some tweaks, and you saw those in the presentation to the plan. But overall, we didn't feel like there were any new metrics that have come out recently that needed to be changed. So when cougar populations are not under predator management plans, we felt like the plan is still sufficient to manage those populations at the moment. And so we did an internal review. We made some recommended changes in order to reflect the new legislation, but we didn't elect to put a committee together yet. Having said that, there are a lot of things that are going to be coming together over the next 2 or 3 years. USU is going to be wrapping up their study they've been doing. They're going to try to develop a population model based on their data. That'd be something new that we haven't had. Or we've had ways to estimate population. We're trying to look at female survival and kitten survival, and that'd be something a little bit new. The Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is drafting an update to their cougar management guidelines. That should be out in the next year or two, and so that'd be a tool we could use. So we anticipate putting a committee together for the next round. So we'd probably be looking 2024, getting a committee together in anticipation of that plan coming up for sunsetting in 2025. So does that help, Braden?
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was a great explanation when you had that up at the central. I thought it really helped clarify some things. So
Thanks.
Appreciate that again.
The only other thing I wanted to add is Amy Canning noticed a typo, an error in the presentation. I wanted to clarify. On the LaSalle, San Juan, and Book Cliffs East, San Juan Mountains and Book Cliffs East units, we have a restriction on hounds for people that don't have bear permits. And we got one of those dates off by a day. So after the 13th of April, it said it was the 14th. After the 13th of April, hounds wouldn't be allowed on those units for pursuit unless they had a bear permit in their pocket. So that's just a point of clarification. It's the same as it was last year. We just didn't shift the date right when we were going through everything.
So when we get to that point, do we need our recommendation to be passed as presented, except for that date? Or if we pass as presented, we're
I'm presenting that now. That's our
Okay.
recommendation. Yeah, I think you're good if you pass as
I was hoping we
presented.
wouldn't have to remember that little
Yeah,
aspect.
that's why I wanted to throw it in there to begin
Thank
with.
you.
So, yeah, and that's all I have. I'm obviously open for questions.
Questions from the RAC?
I've got a couple of questions. If I understand it right, from listening to the other RAC and from what I've read, there's like 54 different
53.
Cool.
Yeah.
cougar units, and the legislature and the director is managing 33 of them, and the wildlife board gets to manage 20.
So there are 33 that are under predator management plans. Yes, and then and there's 20 that we're talking about tonight. That's correct.
And those 33 basically, because of what the legislation has done, have been taken out of the board's jurisdiction.
Right. The directors acted on those. Yeah, already.
Yeah. Okay. This is probably a question that should be directed to others, but isn't there legislative action that says that the board is the one that's supposed to be responsible for managing cougars?
Ultimately, the state legislature it trumps every other org. So the legislature establishes the board, and it does give the board authority to make decisions on wildlife issues. But the legislature is the people's representatives, and ultimately they have the authority. So the way it works is they pass the law and give responsibilities to different agencies and groups, and the governor is responsible for executing the legislation they pass. So yeah, the legislature certainly is within their authority to make changes to those rules. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Bypassing something that they had otherwise given to the board. Okay.
Did you have- okay.
When and how do these units come out of predator management?
So it depends on the unit. Generally speaking, and we can talk about specific units, obviously, if you want. And if they're within the region, we'll have our biologists come up. One thing that we wanted to do when we wrote the new policy is put the I don't want to say onus, put the authority, the power back in down to the district biologist level. And so district biologists have a lot of leeway in making these decisions. They're the ones on the ground. They understand those populations. They know what's going on locally. And so we really want to have their input. And so what we ask them to do is tell us why, give us a justification for why it's going into predator management, and then articulate under what conditions they would look at bringing them out. Generally speaking, the conditions to bring those out of predator management are a reversal of the things that they saw that put them in the first place. A lot of times those are, when we see these conditions improve, then it'll come out. Having said that, there are some instances where it's possible that we think predators are an issue and maybe they're not. And we look at that certainly as well. So if it looks like we've reduced predator densities, but the deer aren't responding, then that might be another instance where a unit would come out. But we really do leave that up to our district biologists and our regional managers. We really want them to have the authority to make those decisions. They know the best what's going on locally.
But do they have any authority, or do they just make recommendations?
Well, we all just make recommendations to the RACs, and ultimately the board is the one that has authority to enact things. But so far as I'm concerned, I put a lot of weight in what our district biologists and regional managers send up to me. So that's by design. I spent most of my career in a region and as a district biologist, and so maybe that's my bias, but I really do feel like the person on the ground that knows the local community, knows the unit, knows what's going on, ought to be making those calls. So that's really what I have emphasized and what we try to do.
But the director put them in. He's the only one that can take them out. Right?
Well, the director will enact them, but we're relying on our district folks to make those recommendations to the director.
Recommendations.
Yeah.
But still, he's the only one that can take it out.
Right. But we'll we'll do that based on the regional recommendation. So if a district biologist and a manager says, hey, we feel like this isn't working, it'll come out.
Okay, I've got one more. Can you envision a scenario where cougar predation would be beneficial, such as with disease in the herd, or any other?
It's something we'd want to take into consideration. If you had high levels of chronic wasting disease, there's probably some things you want to do on the deer side as well. And I know our big game folks have looked at that. I think in general, we want to make sure that if we got to reduce herds based on a disease, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to do a lot of predator work. It really just kind of depends on what's going on in the unit. And there may be some prey switching. It gets complicated, but certainly there'd be some scenarios. And there have been units where we've opted not, where a unit might qualify, but we've struggled to hit quotas in the past, and it just, we could open the floodgates, but it's not going to increase harvest. So let's leave it under the plan and see if there's other ways to address it. So there's certainly instances of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Gene. Tammy, I saw you reach for your mic a minute ago. You still have a question?
Yeah, it's not that important, but Gene had some really intricate questions there.
Mhm.
Mine's just simple.
Okay.
If you have your committee, is it a statewide committee? It's not a regional committee, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like some.
We'll try to, just like all of our other plan committees, we want representatives from different interest groups. So we'll bring some big game folks, some predator folks, some agricultural folks, just any group that is affected by these animals. We'd want to have representation. We've done that in the past. So.
Go ahead, Verlin.
So some of them emails that we receded. Seemed like predator management plan was a swear word. It seems like you're comfortable with it. Are you? I like the idea, and maybe it's a comment that being able to do something now.
Right.
Because my experience with DWR and some other things, it's so slow that by the time any action gets taken, it's too late.
Yeah.
So
That's what the legislature wanted to emphasize, is that we don't always have a year to wait. You know, if we start seeing some problems in the winter and we're going to wait till July to make some decisions, we need a mechanism for the director to say, hey, we're going to have a really hard winter. We need to reduce predator densities as these deer populations crash. And the director has authority to do that. I don't know if it helps, Gene, but we did bring the policy around last year. I think it was one of our remote meetings. So the board did have a chance to vote on the policy, and so they certainly did have a chance to weigh in on how we implement these plans. But yeah, that's the idea, is to be able to act fast, and hopefully you're not a year down the road trying to play catch up. So yeah, that's and the reason why I think there's so many units in predator management right now is just look out your door and see what's going on out there on the landscape. We've seen a couple of really bad years for mule deer, and it's statewide. And so, we'll see going forward how things pan out. But certainly right now we're concerned about deer numbers.
Austin, go ahead.
I have a couple questions. If that predator management plan is turned off, or we pull a unit out of that, and that happens mid-season, what happens to that unit then? Does it roll back from unlimited to a harvest objective, or where would that sit?
It would be most likely to go to harvest objective. So we'd again set a quota. The goal would be, once it comes out of predator management, is to get back to the plan guidelines. And so we look at what's our current females in the harvest on the unit. If it's 50%, for example, we'd look at where we were with the quota before, or how many we harvested over the last 3 years, and make a determination on how to get back to that. I wouldn't expect it to change overnight. So it may take a couple of years to get back to where you're in sync again with those metrics. So I would expect to see us adjust a little bit. There's also going to be some time for that population to sort of stabilize too. With high harvest, we'd expect to see a lot of young cougars sort of coming and going within the unit, especially if older cats have been taken off out of the area. And that'll take a little while to settle out. So we'd expect to see older age classes maybe not come back quite as quickly as maybe females in the harvest, that sort of thing. So as it takes some time to get on to get a reduction in population numbers, we expect to see some time for them to kind of come back to where they were before. And maybe that's not the management goal. Maybe we'd like to manage it a little bit lower density, and we'd make adjustments there. But the bottom line is it'd be under the plan guidelines. So if we kicked above 50% females or 40% females in harvest, we'd make a reduction in harvest objective for that unit.
To clarify that, so when it gets above 40% female harvest, even on a predator management plan unit, is there a trigger there? I'm trying to understand if we're hurting the population. How do we know if we're hurting the cougar population or not?
What we determined when we went through the plan is that was based on some research in Colorado and a lot of research in Utah, that was sort of a threshold above which, above 40%, you start to see a decline in cougar densities in an area. And so that's why we use that as a trigger. So the objective under predator management is to be above 40%. That would indicate that we're decreasing cougar densities on that hunt unit. But once it comes out of predator management, then the plan would apply, and we'd be managing to make sure that we were under 40%. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. What I'm trying to understand, if it's above 40, we say it's working, but say we go to 80%, the females killed it. Is there a trigger to turn it off or not?
That would depend on the individual plan. I don't think we have any plans that have that as a trigger. We're usually looking more at a response from the prey population. And then just as a practical matter, unless you had a very small harvest, 80%, you just don't generally see that. You have a lot of transient males that kind of come and go, and they tend to be the most vulnerable animals in a unit. So, but it wouldn't necessarily, 80% wouldn't necessarily trigger something. Yeah.
I guess my question is, I was looking at current harvest to date on these unlimited units, and I don't know if 35 or 26 in one unit is good, bad, high, low. I don't know, because I'm not a houndsman, so I don't track that.
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to say when there's no quota, is that high or low? And I don't know if you interpret
as
that.
a general rule of thumb. First of all, if the sample size is small, so if the total harvest is less than 10, it probably is just, it's just due to chance. If you've got 20 or 30 cougars that have been harvested, that percentage is probably representative of certainly what the houndsmen are taking, not maybe even necessarily what's available. They'll pass on females at times. But as a rule of thumb, if it's under 40%, you'd expect to see a stable. Closer to 40 you get, the more stable that population would be. The further below 40, the more likely you are to see a growing population. And then the second thing to look at is your adult age classes. Populations with a lot of older age class adults tend to be a little more stable than ones that have a lot of juveniles showing up in the harvest.
Darren, I think maybe what would be helpful in the future, if I can interpret here, Austin, is instead of just giving a number of harvest, if the plan is relying on that percent females in the harvest, put that number on there so they can say we harvested 35 and 50% of them were, you know what I mean? If that's certainly the metric, let's put that number in the information.
Yeah,
Is that helpful, Austin?
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
Any other questions from the RAC?
Even with these numbers and the objectives and the number that they're harvested, there's got to still be some guesswork in coming up with the number in each area. How many years does it take have you experienced that it takes, to stabilize a certain number in a certain unit?
There has been a little bit of research on, Monroe comes to mind. That's one that's local, but correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin. My memory is that they harvested fairly significantly on the Monroe for about 3 years. This is a study that Dr. Wolf at USU did, and they did see a reduction in population on the Monroe. Once they backed off that and reduced the quotas fairly significantly, within 3 years they were back to where they were to begin with. So they can come back fast. One thing we've seen with our current GPS collars is that a lot of these animals move. This is a population that has high interconnectivity throughout the state, especially up and down the Wasatch Range, but all the way from, I'm not talking about just the Wasatch, northern part of the state, but the mountain range that runs down the middle of the state. And we see cats from Manti moving up through Echo, up over the Uintas into Wyoming. We had one cat from the Cache that went across the Uintas and over into Wyoming. We have another one that went to the Tetons up by Jackson, and it's come back, and now it's over by Twin Falls. These are adult female cats. So it's almost an interstate kind of situation where you've got animals coming and going. So that's why they can, if you back pressure off, they can come back fairly quickly, because there's always sort of this movement going on, usually young males, but certainly we've seen it in females as well.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I'm kind of piggybacking on Austin's question here. It sounds like, if I understand this, that our triggers to come out of a plan, a predator management plan, are pretty much based on prey and prey response, and not on the predator themselves. Does that cause any concern that on an unlimited hunt that we could overharvest those and cause some damage?
The objective would be to lower the density. There's two. With prey, it could be a response or it could be a lack of response. So if we see, for example, over 40% harvest on mountain lions in a unit, and maybe over 2 or 3 years, and see no response from the deer on the unit, the conclusion could be that maybe cougars weren't limiting. And so that might be a possibility. The other thing we have, I spoke a little bit about this, but we have kind of this source sink dynamic within the state. There's a lot of places in the state where people just can't access during the winter. And those populations Salt Lake County is a good example, but there are these little pockets, these little areas across the state, which tend to sort of provide cougars as they reproduce to other areas. And so that's a little bit of a safety valve. If we harvest really heavily on a particular unit, there are those source populations that can feed back in. It's something we look at for sure. But there's some safety in the system that way.
A couple more questions.
Sure.
The Henry Mountains, for example, we hear that there's a lot of lions out there. Obviously, it's hard to get to and not many people. And so we have an extremely low harvest. Do we have any other tools in the division's tool set to incentivize houndsmen to go over there? Or is there any other mechanism to get more harvest out of there, or just leave it unlimited and hope gas prices drop?
At this point, we're going with the current strategy. We haven't talked much about other incentives. We do have non-governmental organizations that have put some effort into some units on their own and increased harvest that way. But right now the division isn't looking at anything additional.
And a follow-up to that, we have all these groups in Utah that they love sheep, they love deer, they love elk, but do we have a need for more groups or sportsmen's group to step up and help fund these studies? I know we've got BYU and University of Utah, but do we need more? Just throw that out there.
So we do have funding sources. When we sell, we aren't currently offering cougar permits and conservation permit just because of the situation we're under and things change so much. But we do have that as a funding source. We can certainly approach organizations for funding, even if they don't sell lion permits. And then, of course, the Houndsman Association, they're currently, how many collars did you guys? 6. They purchased, and these are $1,100 collars. They purchased 6 collars to help us get off the ground with a study we're looking at in central Utah to look at scavenging rates. So I don't feel a pinch. I feel like we've had the funding. In addition, we can ask the director's office for funding for projects, and they've been willing to fund that. Typically, we're looking to answer questions about management and how to improve our information for management. That's what USU is looking at, is several things: population estimation. We're looking at how often bears steal cougar kills and how that affects kill rates. Just some basic questions, and then of course other states are doing things that we can look at as well.
One more question.
Sure.
I'm not a cougar hunter much myself, so I'm trying to look through the guidebook and understand. And I know you're going to go over simplification, and I have some comments on that. But
okay,
how do we decide if it's harvest objective or limited entry with harvest objective? And why are some units one way or the other?
So the way it'll look in the new guidebook is we'll have basically 2 tables. We'll have one table that are all harvest objective units, and for some units, the harvest objective will be unlimited. Those are predator management units. And then you have a second table of units that have a limited entry season. It has a harvest objective that's set by the biologist, but it'll have a season on the front end that's limited entry. So it's not different than our split. We're trying to get rid of that as sort of a third option and hopefully simplify things a little bit. Generally units that have limited entry seasons, there have been different reasons why you put in, but typically they're units that don't have a lot of depredation concern and can handle sort of an exclusive opportunity for a small group of people on the front end. And we don't have, deer concerns, those kinds of things. And so that's generally how we determine if we're going to put a limited entry season on a unit. there might be other reasons, recently on the Ponsagon, we tried some different strategies to see if we, if you draw a limited entry tag, you're forced to hunt that unit. You can't just sort of pick and choose and to try to get some harvest in a specific unit. That might be another reason why we'd want to do that. I don't know that it worked very well in that particular instance, but it was worth a try. So those might be some reasons why we'd choose to do that there. It's an option for a district biologist if they want to do that.
Go ahead, Vernon.
On Austin's first question, you mentioned non-governmental organizations. Can you mention what that mean or who that would be?
Groups like SFW, Mule Deer Foundation, groups like that sometimes, and even local groups like the Cache is one where they had some folks that were concerned and put some extra effort. And they're not, an official group, but they had a group of guys that had some concerns about. They'd seen a lot of cause-specific mortality from mountain lions on the Cache, and they wanted to try and take more lions, so they sort of organized. So those kinds of things have been happening sort of organically, depending on the unit and some of the interest, but certainly that's happened.
So I've got a question for you, Tom. Isn't most of that funding come through the legislature for the BYU or Utah State Studies?
Usually it's Pittman-Robertson money. So that's when you buy firearms, ammunition, those kinds of things, that money goes to the federal government, and then they allocate it to the states depending on the number of hunters you have. And so it's a grant back to us. So it's not Utah taxpayer money unless you bought a gun or bullets. So in that way it is, because you do pay a tax on those purchases. And then if you've purchased a hunting license, those kinds of things. So that's, those efforts are funded by sportsmen, even people who maybe don't hunt, but like the shooting sports.
Tammy, I'm not aware of any research that's been funded directly by the legislature. That's almost all internal funding, and then from our partners.
I just know during the legislature, there's a lot of individual bills and grant money done for specific studies through, and everything scientific stuff through Utah State, BYU and that, but there already has to be some sort of a proposal and run up the ladder from the representatives, and sometimes it's backed by SFW or whoever. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. I just didn't know if this was part of it.
And those groups, they contribute a fair amount from those conservation permit programs as well to different research projects. I mean, these collared ungulate studies cost a lot of money, but we're learning amazing things from it, and that's been funded to those sources.
Go ahead, Austin.
One more follow-up to that. To your knowledge, Darren, has the Humane Society, the Mountain Lion Project, some of those organizations that spoke at other RACs, have they contributed anything towards the BYU study?
No.
Or anything to that extent?
No.
Greg?
Mine has to do with the spot and stock. Is there any, what kind of a success rate you expecting on that? Because my experience, seeing a cougar and getting a shot at it,
right.
I think I can count on one hand
like
how many I've seen in my whole time in the hills.
Getting struck by lightning. We sold just over 1,000 spot and stock permits last year. And I think people are not, this isn't like something that people are expecting a high success rate on. I believe I think last I looked, about 7 people of those 1,000 managed to kill a cougar. Now, having said that, there are some Western states that don't allow the use of dogs for cougar hunting. They have much lower, they have higher success rates than that, but still much lower. 99% of mountain lions taken in the state are taken with dogs, with the use of dogs. So people might get good at it, is what I'm saying. But this first year it was pretty low. We expected that to be low.
Go ahead, Gene.
On this spot and stock, I'm a little perplexed. They buy a license and there's a time limit on the license.
Yeah, there's a season.
And the harvest objective has a time limit on the
Yeah.
license.
Yeah.
But cougar predator management units are supposed to be open year round.
Mhm.
Now, if everybody's license expires, how are they open year round?
So they'll be open for a full calendar year. So there's a couple things we're proposing, right? Under the current system, you'd buy a permit, it's valid. It's been valid from usually November 3rd-ish, somewhere in the first week of November. And that's good for the entire year. But, most people are hunting the winter and then they're not generally, so it would be good theoretically the next fall into the following November. Our harvest objective units have year-round seasons. So, they run from November to November, but most of the harvest takes place during that winter. We're proposing to change that up a little bit and come back in December and then start on a July to July schedule. So you'd buy your permit in July, and that really gives you a real year, especially the prime time to be in the field without that license expiring. The reason that the spot and stock permit is the way it is the legislation specifically says that the director needs to provide an opportunity for big game hunters to hunt mountain lions while they're hunting big game. And so we opened that during our big game seasons for most of the duration of the big game season. And that wouldn't change. That'd still be some that would run August 1st through the end of December.
Lots of good questions. That's why we're here, to ask the questions. So we don't want to rush it. Any additional questions? All right, let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the public. Yeah, if there's no questions from the public, we'll get to comments. The first comment card I have is from Corey. Oh, actually, do you want to go over the
Thank you.
input?
I was a little slow picking up what you were putting down there, Austin. We did have some people comment on this, but in typical Southern region fashion, 42.86% strongly disagreed and 42.86% strongly agreed. And then we had 14% that somewhat disagreed. So not a big split. This is an issue that's pretty polarizing. Whichever side of it you're on, you either agree or disagree, and there's not a lot of middle ground. So,
And how many total comments?
I think it was 15.
Okay, so we actually got a fair amount. I didn't think it would be that many.
I'll double check that number for you.
Thanks. All right, first comment from the public is Corey Huntsman. And just a reminder, if you're speaking for yourself, it's a 3-minute. And if you're speaking as an organization, you have 5 minutes.
All right. Corey Huntsman. I am speaking for myself. I'm with the Utah Houndsman Association, but I will just be covering the new collared lion proposal. Dustin Clark will be doing the UHA proposal. First of all, thank you guys for your service on the RAC. I do appreciate this opportunity for public input. So we did recently partner with the Division of Wildlife and BYU on a new cougar study. The parameter of this study is 6 units within the central region: Wasatch Strawberry, Wasatch Temp, Wasatch Cascade, Ochre Mountains East, Nebo, and Nebo Face. Due to the lions' unpredictable behavior and ongoing behavioral changes from the year, from a data standpoint, it'd be greatly beneficial to keep the same animals online for multiple years. With the current hunting pressure on lions, that might be a little tough unless we implement a temporary protection for the collared lions just in those study areas. I'd like to propose that we prohibit killing collared lions on the 6 mentioned units for a 3-year duration with the 8 hounds. That wouldn't include depredation or spot and stock. We wouldn't want a sportsman to get in trouble if he shot a lion from a couple hundred yards away and didn't notice the collar. We certainly want to give the livestock producers the ability to protect their livelihood. The units that we're proposing are, the deer are actually doing pretty good. There's not one of them that are in the predator management plan for deer. We didn't get the big winter kill off like they did further up north, and we're not hit quite as hard as you guys are down here with the drought. There are 3 units that are in predator management for bighorn sheep, but having GPS capabilities on the lion would only benefit the sheep for depredation issues. And one thing we would propose is that if they left the collared, the study area, if they left the perimeter of those 6 units, then they'd be fair game for sportsmen, including with the 8 hounds. The other concern that's been brought up to us is, would we be taking away opportunity from sportsmen? And I called it 6 units, but it's technically 7 units, because we are going to try and collar some lions on the Salt Lake Wasatch Front mountain range. But there's not currently a hound season for that, so we didn't see a point in including that in the proposal. But so far, we've collared 6 lions. 5 of those are toms. 5 of those are females, 1 tom. So if we continue at that ratio, we're trying to get 30 lions collared. If we continue at that ratio, we're only talking 5 toms spread out on 7 units. I really don't think that's taken a whole lot of opportunity away from sportsmen, but it is, from a data standpoint, it is greatly beneficial. The last thing, we did run this through the Central RAC. It passed with an 11-1 vote, and then we went to the Northern RAC, and it passed with an 8-1 vote. You guys have any questions for me?
Go ahead, Vernon.
Well, Darren just told about, how these cats move. It looks to me like they might mess up your study if they move out of your study area and get killed. So I would think, and I'm a fan of more studies. I think this cougar deal is something we don't understand as far as the numbers and everything. And so I'd probably be in favor of trying not to kill any collared ones unless spot and stalk or depredation. That's my comment.
So no question, just to clarify, just a comment. Okay, I don't think we have any questions then, right?
Okay,
Thanks, Corey. Brian Hoover.
Thank you. I'm Brian Hoover. And again, as Corey stated, thank you for your service on the RAC and to sportsmen and to the wildlife of Utah. But I want to expand that just a little bit to those online and also those of you that are in the audience. We're all here for the same reason, and that's the betterment of the wildlife here in this state. So thank you all for putting in the time to come down and put your input in and your feedback to the board. So I just want to stand up and kind of expand on some of the items that Corey stated. I'm in 100% support of the study. And in the current Cougar Management Plan, it actually asks for additional study considerations. So I'm just going to quote the current Cougar Management Plan. It states under Cougar research objectives, increased base understanding through continued research designed to address questions relative to cougar management in Utah. Coming right back to this gentleman's statement that the support of the studies is huge for the understanding of what's going on within those populations and how they interact. So this study is literally in its infancies and just being fully established moving forward with BYU. Some of the items that the Cougar Management Plan calls out that it would like to, in order of priority, understand were alternative population estimates, radio calling cougars, prey switching in cougars, cougar habitat use and predation behaviors. And this study has the opportunity and has had discussions around all of those. I don't know that the study will answer all of those questions, but as it comes to fruition with West Alexander and BYU, where our intent is to hit as many of those different items as possible in an effort to do nothing but give good, solid data to those regional biologists and the RACs and the Wildlife Board in an effort to manage our wildlife here in Utah. So again, with Corey's recommendation, I'd like to second that just with a statement of we're asking for no harvest in those 6 units. They are all in the central region. We would actually love to see the state be a no harvest by use of dogs, but it wasn't felt that that would be accepted throughout the state. But I did want to put it out there. It has been a highly debated item within the Hound Association and ourselves. It actually was a recommendation, a first recommendation in the Northern RAC. And in the Northern RAC, that first recommendation did fail. The second recommendation following the 6 units did succeed with the 8-1 vote. Any questions for me?
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And the last comment card I have is Dustin Clark. I did notice there's more members of the public here than that. If you want to comment, please hurry and fill out a comment card. We'll get to you. It's not too late if you want to make any comments.
My name is Dustin Clark. I'm representing the Utah Houndsman Association tonight. Again, thank you all for your time and for your service and for your care for the management of Utah wildlife. One of the first issues that the UHA wanted to propose was the removal of the public lands verbiage from the rule R 657-10-21. I mean, hopefully all of you have received our letter as far as what we wanted to propose, so I don't have to read it to an extent, but we feel that this rule is in line with our view of responsible management and practices for our public wildlife resources on public lands. Under Section 1, the depredating cougar can be removed within 96 hours on public land, but under Section 4, a transient cougar can be removed from public lands for no other reason than it moved onto public ground in a specific area. The UHA recommends and asks for removal of public land grazing allotments verbiage, specifically the clause and public land grazing allotments out of this rule. The UHA does not ask for removal of private lands from the chronic depredation rule. And then as well, Corey and Brian covered as far as, killing of collared cougars. I mean, I agree with this gentleman that I think it should be statewide. If we're going to put the time and money into these studies, why should we allow them to be killed when they're so beneficial to what we can accomplish as far as figuring out what's going on with these cougars, what's happening, what they're killing, what's going on as far as kill takeover from bears and stuff like that. So that's probably my personal opinion. I shouldn't put that in the UHA, but also, I'd like to not add the Beaver East unit to predator management designation. The mule deer data from 2020 shows that the adult deer in this unit are going into winter in a poor body condition. This data is a sign of habitat issue and not depredation as a limiting factor. HB 125 does not apply unless the division determines predators are a significant factor on big game populations. So we'd like to see that not go into predator management and stay where it's at now. We'd also like for the DWR and whoever to establish clear criteria for when a unit enters predator management and when it will be removed from predator management. Right now, as far as we know and can find, there's no clear statements that say, well, the deer are doing this, the lions are doing this, we're going to put it into predator management. It's just whether there's just no clear criteria or clear set parameters that say, oh, this one's going to go in or this one's going to come out. It's more of a recommendation or a kind of hearsay from biologists or from what people are seeing versus kind of just set in stone things that, oh, this hit it, we're going to pull it out, or it did this, we're going to put it in. So, and then also we would also like to move the units that are in harvest objective now. We would like to see them go into split season instead of harvest objective. We feel that it would force hunters that we need to go towards predator management units versus just being able to hunt wherever they would like. If those are split units that they have to draw a tag for first, that puts more pressure on the units that are unlimited and over-the-counter tags from people that are just looking to kill a cougar versus looking to harvest a trophy. It just limits them on the areas that they can hunt, and it simplifies the proclamations to 2 types of cougar hunts versus just to unlimited and split units instead of unlimited, harvest objective, and split units, or just limited units, which we have none right now. This change would remove 9 units from harvest objective and has the potential to increase hunters targeting predator management units by 280. This change would still leave 31 units available for over-the-counter hunters. Any questions? Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Dustin. Appreciate it. Before we move into the discussion from the RAC, I just want to make a couple comments. One, we do have the biologist for these units online. So specifically, the Houndsman Association has addressed the beaver unit, and Mike Wardle is the biologist for that unit. So if you want to ask him questions, he is online and can address that. Second, I just want to thank you guys. That's a haul, a long drive to come down here, and we appreciate that. It is nice to be back in these public meetings where we have this opportunity, and we really appreciate you making the effort and coming down with your input. One comment I do want, well, actually, maybe one more, maybe how I'd like to see this go. Let's open it up for general discussion with the RAC. And then if we could, on the motions, I think all the motions, my guess would be the motions that we're going to have will be pertaining to the recommendations from the Houndsman Association. Let's address those individually, and then we'll pass the remainder as presented. So once we get to the point we want to look at motions, let's kind of look at those individually. And then the comment that I want to make to start, I have a couple more comments, but the comment I'd like to make before we just open it up to everybody is the comment was made earlier, the question, and then the comment was made that where do the funds come to do these collar studies? They come from sportsmen. I think that's a great item to note. But even more specifically on this, the recommendation from the Houndsman Association on these 6 units with the collar study going on, not only did they put up the money for the collars, but my understanding, and I guess this may be in the form of a question, but my understanding is the Houndsman also went in and donated their time and efforts to collar those lines. That, I believe, is probably more expensive than the collars by probably a significant amount. And so it's not just the cost of the collars. The Houndsmen have really gone out of their way to help with this study and to be proactive. And I think that deserves at minimum a comment and some recognition there. So again, appreciate you guys being here. And with that, I'll open it up to discussions from the RAC. Go ahead, Austin.
I want to talk about the collars for a second. Are there currently any units or species or areas for any other game animals in Utah that we're aware of where we limit the take of collared animals?
Right now, no. The rule allows for it. So the mechanism is if we determine that we needed to prohibit it, we will put something in the guidebook for specific units or state or whatever. Our approach so far on all collared animals has been to discourage it in our guidebooks, but to not write a ticket for it, I guess, is to just sum it all up. But we do have collared animals taken throughout the state. I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming number, but when you're talking about a sample size of 30 compared to a couple hundred, one can make a difference. And it is definitely frustrating to spend all the effort walk your guts out to put a collar on a lion and have someone shoot it the next week. So that's frustrating. I want to add too, these guys caught these 6 lions on dry ground this spring too. So it was, they know what they're doing. That's tough to do. So anyway, they're doing a good job.
I think my comment about that, I'm big on the simplification of this and not being a everyday houndsman. The guidebook is complicated for me, as is. And I feel like this adds another level of complexity. And I personally, feel that it's the right thing to do to stop them from harvesting those collared lions. But it's on hounds, with hounds only, on a harvest objective permit. So we've added a little complex layer in the guidebook there, where it would be easier to say with hounds statewide, right? As far as the guidebook or rules go, in my mind. So that's my comment about the collars.
I would agree to Foston. I also agree with the Houndsman Association on collared animals. Let's leave them alone.
If I can make a comment there, I do like this proposal because it's limited to 6 units in 3 years. I don't know that I could get on board. I don't vote anyways unless it's a tie, but I don't know that I could get on board with a across the board limitation. There was a cougar a few years ago. I don't remember. That 12 years come to mind that it lived on the Stansbury Range, I believe, and you couldn't harvest it. That seems a little excessive to me. So generally, I wouldn't agree with that part, but I definitely agree with this request.
I guess I have a question on that. How long do the collars last? How long are they good for?
Generally 3 years, good rule of thumb. It depends on how often they send. The more burden you put on the collar, the less life you get out of the battery. So it's just all about how much data are you uploading. But they typically last about 3 years. So about what they're asking, 3 years.
Tammy, you have a comment?
I would agree with you also, Braden, and I have to commend the houndsman for putting the money where your mouth is, so to speak. I mean, I'm all about that. And I agree with that central region. I'm on board with that 100%. The statewide one, I say we take it back to the committee when they redo the committee and talk about that. But I think the central region is a legitimate ask, and looks like a lot of time and effort went into it, and we don't want you guys to lose your investment.
I guess I would be in support of a statewide one that was limited to 3 years. If that's the length of the collar, you would get a good study, I think, by that time, and have a whole bunch of data and could reassess it at that point. So.
Yeah, but we aren't putting the collars on this year and going to pull them all off in 3 years. It's an ongoing thing. We're constantly putting collars on. So it's not, 4 years from now, there's going to be animals with collars on them.
But, well, I understand that. And you're going to
Okay.
have collars that aren't working and collars that are just put on. But at least you'd have a 3-year moratorium on it that you
Okay.
could get a whole lot of good data.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just want to make sure we're
No.
talking apples to apples.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll make a comment. As far as I understand, we do not have the authority to recommend Beaver East be pulled out of predator management plan. That wouldn't be our thing. But I would like to hear from the biologist, maybe, if he wants to tell us why we're headed there with Beaver East and where that's going.
Can you hear me okay, Mr. Chair?
Loud and clear. Nice tie.
Okay, good.
You're want to stand up and see if you're wearing shorts?
Yeah, I'm not going to stand up for everybody. I don't want to prove you right. So, on the Beaver East, the reason for the recommendation to go over or into predator management came from collars that we put out the last 2 years on mule deer. So the Houndsman Association is correct that body condition scores have been low. In 2019, they were really low. This past winter, we were actually just below the statewide average. So we weren't as bad this year. But with the collars, the big thing has been the cause-specific mortality that we've learned. Of the 33 lions that we've had killed in the last 2 years, 58% of those have been lion kills. We're We're currently at 7% for our fawn survival on the Beaver East, which is really low. And so that's the basis for the recommendation. And it comes back to we're seeing a lot of lion take on the steer population that has decreased dramatically in the last 5 years. You know, we were above 15,000 deer back in like 2015, and currently our estimate's about 10,000. So we've seen a sharp decline. I don't see this as a silver bullet to save the mule deer, but hopefully it can help them give a shot in the arm.
Mike, this is Austin again. If I could ask you a follow-up question. Mount Dutton as well, could you speak to that on why we're not in a predator management plan there? We did receive comments about concern about the deer herd there, lack of deer. Can you speak to that?
Austin, that would be Kyle Christensen, one of our other biologists. Kyle, if you want to speak to Dutton, please.
Yeah, I can speak to that. The biggest problem we've seen on the Dutton is we haven't filled the quota. So I just didn't feel that a predator management plan was necessary. We only killed 7 lions last year out of 14. And so I just didn't think it was really going to be beneficial to go into a predator management plan until we can see adequate take on the unit.
Thank you. I think that's an important point, that he didn't roll it right to predator management because we have a harvest and it didn't reach it.
Go ahead, Tammy.
I'd also like to speak on the Beaver East unit. As a public official, and you run into people at the grocery store and the gas station and anywhere else they can corner you, predators are an issue on the Beaver East, beaver units in general. So I would not recommend pulling that out either.
Go ahead, Austin.
All right, I've got a comment about, I know we're kind of jumping around topics, but on the simplification, I would like to see the spot and stock permit, which I understand is a director order. I've got a copy of his order here, but I would like to see those season dates match. I understand the idea was to be over top of our fall seasons, but is there any way we can make a recommendation for that to match a July 1st through June 30th to take into account shed hunters, people out in the winter recreating spring? Like, I know chances are slim, right? But it's confusing to me. I buy both tags. I don't hunt cougars very often. Which one is it? And then this one has a date, and then this one follows dates that aren't even on your permit because you got to follow the table and call a hotline or go online. It's confusing. I'd like to see that match. Could we do that?
I think, I mean, obviously this discussion will make it back to the board, and I'm sure we could discuss it. I think the big sticking point here is the language in the legislation. And for this specific issue, it says during big game hunts. And so that's why the director set the dates where they are, why we recommended to the director that those should be the dates. So speaking with our, Attorney General's office, they felt like to be in compliance with what the legislation dictates, that's where we need to be. So that's why it is the way it is.
But the big game board would have authority to make that change if they chose, correct?
Yeah, I mean, outside of the legislation, I mean, I don't want to speak out of school, but obviously they can recommend hunt structures however they want.
So it would be, I mean, it would meet the requirements of this legislation, and then it would give a little more, as I would interpret it.
I think it's certainly a discussion item worth having and passing along.
Just curious. Yeah, I mean, I think if we made a motion, it would give the board an opportunity to discuss it if we get to that point.
Chair, I would like to hear some comments from the other RAC members about the harvest objective units all having a limited entry. I mean, what it does, as far as I understand, is it's a November through February limited entry structure. They only give out as many tags as they can kill lions harvest, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, and then whatever lions don't get killed or tags that don't get filled will roll to an open harvest. So what it does is it blocks out the winter or the bulk of that early season for harvest objective guys and leaves a premium, for limited entry. It leaves a premium experience for them, if you will. And then it'll roll to everybody else to come in. I know the dates are different depending on the unit. It's complicated for me to figure out when they open and when they don't and how many's left. But is there something we could do there? Do we like the limited entry? Are we hanging on to it because everybody has points? Or why do we have to keep splitting it? That's where I don't feel like I have a good handle on it.
Do you want, yeah, please do.
I don't want to short circuit the discussion, but just going back to the principle of giving ultimate decision-making power to our district biologists, I'd really like them to have the flexibility to decide if they want to have a limited entry season or not. And there may be multiple reasons why or why not they'd want to do it. Currently, half of those units have limited entry season, the other half don't. So it's 10 and 10 out of the 20. That's just my 2 cents, obviously. Have the discussion, but just kind of where we're coming from.
I'll follow up real quick on
Sure,
that there. You're going to change this though. So we're no longer going to apply for limited entry in October, right? Because you're going to bring it here in December. So we would apply in the spring to start.
The numbers would be approved, but the draw timing would be pretty similar to what it is now, but we'd be bringing recommendations a lot earlier, essentially, for the following year. Does that make sense? So a lot of the draw stuff would be similar, and those hunts wouldn't begin probably into limited entry until later. But so what you might have is July 1st, you'd set a quota, it'd open, you'd have a limited entry window, and we may have to work through that. But I'm actually drawing a blank on it right now. I need to look back at my notes.
But on these dates, would the limited entry dates roll to July 1st? It would open? If
Yeah.
you drew a permit?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks for jogging my brain. Yes, that's how it would work. It would they'd draw, but you'd be drawing the October before the next July. Does that make sense? So you'd know if you had your permit prior to the new year, but the season wouldn't start until July 1. Those would be limited entry from July 1 through February or whenever, or March, whenever they typically are. And then they would open if there were any additional animals to be taken. So thanks, I needed a nudge.
Chad, did you have a comment?
I don't.
Oh, okay. I want to make a comment along what you're talking about here, Austin. And I've made similar comments for years, even prior to being on the RAC. So I'd feel a little neglectful if I quit now. But let me preface this a little bit. There's a lot of discussion in the hunting community right now that as you hunt from state to state, and a lot of hunters are moving state to state, it's so hard to keep yourself out of trouble with all the rules and regulations. And as you hunt multiple states, trying to keep up on all the different rules as you move around is extremely difficult, to the point that you're almost guaranteed to make a game violation somewhere sooner or later. The comment I would have in that regard is, and I've had it for years, there is not a more complicated proclamation than the Cougar Proclamation of Utah. I mean, it is, and I really appreciate the division has made an effort the last couple of years to simplify it. I know that's a concerted effort. I know that's an attempt, but holy smokes, it's a mess. So I would just continue to encourage. I don't know what we do. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, because the division's encouraged to simplify it, and then the public says, and by the way, we want this, and we want this, and we want this. And so, but just a general comment. I appreciate the effort being made, but this is one tough proclamation.
I'd like to just ramble here a little bit. I agree that I struggle with trying to figure this proclamation out. And I think that the legislature didn't help any with their jumping into this thing. And well, I might as well say that while I'm at it. I don't think we should have biology by ballot box. And I don't want to see the legislature continue to pull this stuff. Shows that we look like Colorado West. And while I'm rambling, I want to talk a little bit about porcupines.
I did not see that.
I'm not sure that's on the agenda, but we'll let it slide.
We're going to talk about porcupines. Most of you aren't old enough to know when there was porcupines. Some of you probably haven't even seen a damn porcupine. But there was porcupines all over the place in my day. And in the name of conservation, and by the encouragement of the Forest Service and the Fish and Game and everybody else, I and a lot of other people went out and did our soul dirty to kill as many porcupines as we could. And we did one hell of a good job. And I don't want to see the same thing happen to cougars. This thing could go a little too far. And I don't want to see that. I guess that'll do for right now.
Go ahead, Verlin.
I had a government trapper tell me that's why there's no porcupines. There's too many cougars. That's what the young ones eat.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just wondering, we've gone all over the place, and I'm kind of a linear guy, and my brains are starting to scramble. So I'm wondering if we could take these and discuss them in order, or maybe it's time for a motion in order of what the houndsman presented, starting with the collared cats, and then moving through those that we can vote on and those that we can make a recommendation on.
Yeah, I think we're about there. I think Verlin was still making a comment, or was that your comment?
We pushed his button red, so. I
Oh,
thought
did
it
he?
was done.
Sorry, I
Well,
thought
that
he was.
my comment, but if
Oh, I
we're
thought
going
you
to
were
do that, I
stepping on.
wanted to bring up this public lands deal.
Okay, so here, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's time to start going a little more linear. I did feel like intentionally having some open discussion, but let's get it a little more linear. I think let's approach maybe the recommendations, any of those we want to talk about. I would suggest that we would start watching the other RACs and what's happened. I would suggest we start with this study on the 6 units. I think that one may be fairly straightforward. We can jump to the public lands and we can hit the other ones, but let's approach them one by one. So any more comments on the collared lions on the 6 study units? And if there isn't more discussion, we'd entertain a motion on that item. If we want to have a motion, we don't have to have a motion. We can just accept as presented if that's what we choose. Go ahead, Austin.
I'll make the motion. See if I can make it clear that we prohibit the killing of collared lions in the 6 units designated within the study in the central region by use of hounds.
For 3 years.
For 3 years.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
So we have a motion by Austin and a second by Tammy. Any additional discussion on that?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Does that include the recommendation that the spot and stock, how does that, because we were bouncing back and forth, spot and stock or predation is?
Austin addressed it by hounds, so that was part of the
Okay.
motion. And I think the motion is just their recommendation as they wrote it essentially. I mean, it's a pretty
Okay. All right.
well-written
Okay.
recommendation. Any additional discussion?
I guess I would like to amend that motion, if I could, to include statewide. No harvest of collared lions by hounds for a period of 3 years. So I don't know if this is the appropriate time to do that. Or,
So to follow the process, we have a motion and a second. You can make a motion to amend the motion, and then we would vote on the amendment. If that passes, then that alters the original motion. So you would, if you need to make a motion to amend and see if you get a second.
I'll make a motion to amend.
Okay, so we have a motion to amend by Chad
I'll second it.
and a second by Nick that it would be a statewide. Did you have a time period on that?
3 years.
Okay, so a statewide no harvest by hounds on collared cougars for 3 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's the motion to amend. Any discussion on that? Go ahead, Berlin.
The problem with that is, and the comment I made earlier is, yeah, there are going to be some colored lines that leave these 6 areas and would have the opportunity to be taken. The problem I see right now is those collars aren't going to fall off in 3 years. They're not going to turn purple, or they're not. So you won't know. I mean, that 3-year time period is, I don't think works, and maybe makes it so it won't work.
Well, you could just remove it would just remove the prohibition, just make it so it's no longer prohibited to after 3 years. We'd just change the regulation. So.
Okay. Yeah, well, I still have some reservation to that.
Any other discussion? Go ahead, Oscar.
Can we ask the question, do we have currently any collared cougars outside of those areas as part of other studies, and how many would that be?
Yes, we probably have throughout the state, in addition to the 6 in the area. Doing the math in my head, do you know how many you guys have?
Sent their email out yesterday.
Oh, but I know we have 15 in the USU study. These 6, and that'd be the Book Cliffs, the Manti, and the Cache. But I know the region has a few too. So yeah, so 17, and there may be more depending on. Sometimes we put collars on if we need to move an animal, just keep an eye on it, so that kind of thing.
All right, so we have amended motion with the second. Okay, go ahead.
Further discussion, is it appropriate to ask the Utah Houndsman Association where they're present, their opinion of that, changing it to statewide?
They already suggested that that's what they would like when they were
You'd be
speaking.
completely in support of that.
All right, let's vote. All in favor?
Okay, so we're voting on the
The
amendment.
amended.
So the amendment, we're voting to know whether you want the original motion to be limited to the 6 units or to be statewide. Okay, just so we're clear on what we're voting on.
Well, if the amended passes,
If the
we don't.
amendment passes, then we will go back and then vote on the original. We'll still have a second vote on the original motion, but it will be amended to be statewide.
Go ahead.
Already the DWR has a policy of discouraging taking collared animals, don't they? So.
Yeah, in the proclamation, it already asks you not to harvest colored animals, but it's not illegal.
Yeah. And I just want.
Kevin, let me ask, if we have a first and second on this, if Austin's okay, could he change his initial motion to this so we don't have to do 2 motions and have that confusion? Or do we want to do it, vote on the amendment and then go back to the original motion? It seems confusing to vote on the amendment that's contradictory to the initial.
If Austin and whoever seconded his original motion agrees to just accept the amendment, we could avoid the first vote and just vote on that. And then there could be a second motion if that fails. So,
because the amendment is significantly different from the initial motion. It doesn't seem to make sense to go back and vote on the initial motion if this amendment passes.
well, if
That's how the process works.
That's how the
we'll follow
process
the
works.
process. Let's just follow the process. I won't
Okay.
try to confuse it. Okay, so we have, go ahead, Vernon.
Well, it seems to me like, they're already asked across the board not to kill a collared animal. It's recommended not to. It's not illegal. I always have problems with making stuff illegal that where the law enforcement side of this deal comes in. So I think it's better to not go statewide, just have it be a recommendation that we don't kill a collared animal, but not make it so that it's a crime to do it if you, anyway, I just don't really have a problem getting law enforcement side of DWR involved in it. If somebody kills a collared animal, they're probably going to try to destroy the collar, and and I don't know how good the pelt of a animal that's had a collar rubbing around its neck for years is anyway. But anyway, that's my problem with it going statewide is I think the less we make things illegal, the better it is. I think a lot of people will, if it's a big cat, then they'll probably kill it. But if it isn't, and especially the houndsmen know the good they're getting out of the tracking, they'll try to talk their guy out of killing it. I think it's an honor system deal, and I just have a hard time making more laws for law enforcement to try to enforce when it's pretty hard for them to enforce some of the laws that we ask them to do.
All right. I think we're ready to go to vote on this amended motion. So again, the amended motion is that
It's the amendment to the motion.
the amendment,
We don't have an amended motion yet.
the amendment to the motion. Boy, semantics, Kevin, come on. Cut me a break here. So the amendment to the motion is that we would prohibit the harvesting for 3 years any collared cougar in the state by hounds. Okay, all in favor? Raise your hand.
Hold on, now let's do a round.
You want to do a roll call?
Let's do a roll call.
Okay, Tammy,
Nay.
Verlin,
Nay.
Gene,
Nay.
Greg,
Nay.
Austin,
Nay.
Chuck,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
Chad,
Yes.
and Dan. Gonna see if Dan's still awake. His speaker went on and off. Dan, are you there? Okay, no response from Dan. So we have, what was it? 5 opposed and 3 in favor. So the amendment to the motion fails.
Right, so now we're back.
So now we'll go back to the initial.
Now we're back to the initial motion.
Dan just, he chatted nay. Dan chatted.
Okay, so we have 6 opposed and 3 in favor. So now we'll go back to the original motion by Austin, seconded by Tammy, that we would not harvest collared cougars on the 6 study units for a period of 3 years with use of hounds. Basically, the houndsman motion, we've used their word. So let's go roll call on that. Tammy?
Yay.
Verlin?
Yes.
Gene?
Yes.
Craig?
Yes.
Austin?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
And Chad?
Yes.
And Dan?
Chatted yes.
Yes, so passes unanimously. All right, so now there are other items on the table. Verlin, you said you wanted to discuss the private lands one. We can hit that next.
And to be clear on that. That's not part of our recommendation, Verlin. So if we just went with the division's recommendation, it wouldn't include that.
All right. Yeah, that would be my discussion on it. That there's a lot of depredation that goes on public lands, on grazing allotments. And I think that wording needs to stay in on that. So that's my comment, whether there's more discussion.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I'm just wondering, the way it's worded right now, it says, if we take that out, would that mean that we couldn't kill any depredating animals on public lands? That's what it looks like. Because right now it says it can issue depredation permits to take cougar on specified private lands and public land grazing allotments with chronic depredation situations. It seems like if we take that out, then suddenly we can only take problem animals off of private lands. And it makes me a little bit nervous. And I wonder if I'm seeing that right or if I've got that wrong.
So the proposal from the Houndsman Association would be outside of the 96-hour period where there's an active. So their concerns is about take in chronic situations. So maybe the sheep aren't even on the mountain. It's important that the RAC realizes that the rule language is taken directly from code. And so we don't have authority. The legislature would have to change that, but obviously we could, have that discussion. And but it's important to remember, in the form of a rule change, that wouldn't be possible. We'd have to have legislative changes in order to change that, to remove that language from the rule.
So just to be clear, we've got 96 hours, we can still take care of those.
Right. There's a 96.
Or if the legislature took this language out, then
Right.
we wouldn't have a
Yeah.
prolonged period.
Yeah, we're talking about, we don't do it very often, but we do sometimes have producers that are having considerable losses year after year after year to lions. And we do, in some cases, issue depredation permits outside of the season. When the sheep are on the mountain, a lot of times wildlife services will start on a kill and they're able to catch the lion and they'll remove the lion. We want to solve those problems. Sometimes they're not successful, and we have the opportunity, and our biologists can work with producers to give them permits so that later in the season, when hunting is a little bit more favorable, to go out and try to remove a particular lion, bearing in mind that the lions move around a lot. So we really like our biologists to have the flexibility to kind of figure out what makes sense. But ultimately, we want to try to solve a problem. Kevin?
And Darren, just to clarify what you said at the beginning, the 96-hour portion is in state code.
Mhm.
And that changed from 72 hours to 96 hours with the same legislation that directed us to implement predator management plans for big game species. The chronic portion of this is not in code.
It is in code.
The
Yeah.
chronic portion
Yeah.
is in code
It's
as
a
well?
different.
Okay.
It's a different code section. So
This is outside of our
this
purview
is word
anyway,
for
so.
word what the legis, and they did amend the 96 hours the same time as they passed HB 125.
I didn't realize the chronic portion was now in code.
And it did
So,
change, Kevin.
okay.
It didn't used to be that way, but
Yeah,
it
so
did.
really this is outside of our purview or the board's, is what it sounds like to me.
Any other discussion on motion? Oh, thank you. Any other discussion on motions, additional motions that want to be made?
You want a review of what the different options were?
Yeah, let's review it.
Okay, in addition to what we already dealt with in whether we're going to allow the take of collared lions, there was a request to move harvest objective units to split units. And I think that came from the Houndsman Association. There was a motion to keep the Beaver East unit out of predator management, but again, that came under the legislation and probably isn't under the purview of the RAC or the board, if I'm understanding things correctly, Darren, to do anything in that. Am I correct there?
Right.
Yeah, so really the only other thing outstanding is a request to move all harvest objective units to put them under the split hunt strategy instead of harvest objective.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I thought there was one more proposal to call for clear criteria for moving plans in and out of our units in and out of.
Yep, that is correct. I have that.
That's out of our purview too.
No,
though, isn't it? Or can we do that?
The predator management policy, which is what sets those guidelines, that did go in front of the board, and so there could be a recommendation from the RAC to the Wildlife Board to reopen the predator management policy to clarify the objectives. I have that one written down too. Chuck, thanks for the reminder. So there's those two outstanding.
Okay, so there's the two outstanding items that were input from the public. If we want to address them, we don't have to address them. So that's up to the RAC if we want to address those. Go ahead, Verlin.
I make a motion, we accept the Cougar recommendations and rule changes.
As presented, right?
As presented.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
So we have a motion to accept the remainder as presented with a second by Tammy. Additional discussion on that. I just want to make one comment on this one, the additional discussion. This has been a little bit of an interesting RAC for me. Typically, the comments you get from the public and the emails and the messages you get are all things that are in opposition. People want to be heard, I don't like this or I want this. Very rarely do you get many comments saying they support the recommendations. Those just kind of, most people, if they don't have something that they want changed, they don't comment. I don't know what the rest of the RAC saw, but I personally, probably 4-1, the comments I got on this one was, please support the division's recommendations. That was very unique. I don't know that I've seen that before on the RAC, including this afternoon. I've been getting texts all afternoon saying, please support the division's recommendations. So that's been, I guess, just an interesting thing to me. That's a lot of support. Go ahead, Austin.
We're in discussion on the motion on the
Yeah,
floor.
discussion on the motion.
So can I move to make an amendment to this motion to adjust the spot and stock season dates to match harvest objective? That would be my amendment.
Okay, so there's an amendment to move the spot and stock seasons dates to match the harvest objective dates. Do we have a second on that amendment?
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a second by Chad. Any additional discussion on the amendment to the motion? Go ahead, Tammy.
I was just gonna say, I'm not sure that we can do that. Can we? Recommend date changes?
That's my comment.
Yeah.
Legislature's gonna set that up.
So there's my question. I'm not sure that we can.
I'm still of the opinion the board can. That's my opinion. I know it may differ, but I think they would still meet the mandates required by the legislation that those seasons would happen during the hunting seasons, and then it would be in addition to that. So they didn't limit it, saying you can only do spot and stock during the big game seasons. They said you will do or you will have an opportunity. So I don't see this as opposition to the legislation, is my 2 cents.
So it wouldn't count. Well, in my opinion, my Cougar tag that I've been packing and renewing for the last 2 or 3 years is a spot and stock.
I mean, the other comment to that is, man, the success rates on that is so low. Why would we not want more people putting that tag in their pocket and getting that revenue? It doesn't make any sense to limit that. Go ahead. Again, I'm offering my opinion here, so go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I'm all for this spot and stock. It's an opportunity for the public to get out and do some hunting. I'm all for it. I think that it should be a year-round thing, and I believe that the board did set the dates for that. I think the board has the authority to extend the dates for that. And if we're going to do this cougar management year-round, we'd ought to have the spot and stock year-round.
Okay, so we have an amendment to the motion to align the spot and stock dates with the harvest objective dates. Let's go ahead and vote on that. Tammy?
Yes.
Verlin?
Yes.
Gene?
Yes.
Craig?
Yes.
Austin?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
And Chad?
Yes.
Dan? I think he said yes, if I'm a good lip reader. Yep. So we have a unanimous on the amendment to the motion. Now let's go back to the initial motion to accept the remainder as presented. Tammy?
Yes.
Vernon?
Yes.
Gene?
No.
Craig?
Yes.
Austin?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
Chad,
Yes.
and Gene, I want to give you a chance to voice your opposition there. Oh, sorry, Dan. Yes again, thank you. Gene, I want to give you a chance to voice your opposition if you want to.
My opposition is with the predator management situation and no true criteria or no plan to get units out of predator management. I think that part is, well, it's the legislature's fault, but as long as there's no plan, I'm not for voting for this as presented.
Thanks, Gene. Well said. Appreciate it. Well, that concludes the agenda items for tonight's meeting. Again, appreciate everybody being here. Good to be back in person. Appreciate the houndsman traveling. Thank you for that effort. Next RAC meeting set for September 7th in Beaver. I will not be here, so we'll have to, hopefully Riley's here. If not, someone else will have to.
It's not in Beaver. So let me maybe just some clarification there.
Okay.
So now that we're going hybrid with this system, we're limited to locations where we have the technology and the bandwidth to set this meeting up. And so right now we have this building, we have the DNR building in Richfield, that both we can set up. We've also talked with SUU and with Snow College, again, here in Cedar and in Richfield for our bigger meetings. They have, they can accommodate the technology that we need. So I guess what I'm saying is we're limited to Cedar City or Richfield under our current scenario.
Do the other regions move their meetings around as much as we do? Is that a southern region
No,
thing?
they don't move them at all. And that's really just because we're by far the largest
Yeah.
region. So we've tried to accommodate travel for, Verlin shouldn't have to travel the farthest every time, just most of the time.
I think Berlin deserves it. Yeah, that's my question. My personal thought is, I think some consistency would be good. I really want to see more public input, and it's just hard for the public to stay up to date, and it's hard enough. I think the more consistency we could add, I would be supportive of just doing them here.
So we vote on it every year in December. We set our schedule. Right now, Phil, help me. We've got our next meeting.
Well, I thought that they were all, well, I don't know as far as what we had as far as different cities, but we had talked about doing them here, except for the two big ones, November.
No, but not all here. They're alternating back and forth between here and Richfield. I will send the RAC out a schedule that essentially I made a unilateral decision on where they're going to be based on just kind of rotating back and forth between Cedar and Richfield. If you feel strongly that they need to be in Richfield or more need to be in Cedar, you're welcome to let me know.
Okay, we can look at that.
Quick question on that, Kevin. Is there, as we transition into this hybrid, is there a chance for the public to participate and comment remotely?
No, not as of yet. Right now, we're limiting to they can comment prior to online. And so that option is there. But in terms of commenting during the meeting, that right now that's limited to in person. And that the board agreed to that as we presented it.
Yeah,
So.
they discussed that in the board meeting, and that's where they landed.
And I would say some of those bigger meetings, Ridgefield, if it's in that auditorium, you have a lot more seating for the public. So I would.
But yeah,
think
same
that
thing. We have a similar venue here at SUU. So for our bigger meetings, we'll be at one of the two colleges, either in one of their larger auditoriums, either at SUU or at Snow College in Richfield.
I'm more concerned about Verlin driving than Kevin. I say we do them all in Richfield.
That's what I say.
What about Chad and Nick? They're going farther than I am.
I feel.
Oh, great. Now we're back to moving every time. Yeah, wherever we land is fine.
I feel that the two big meetings, November and April, I believe they are, should be centered as much as possible. So probably Cedar City for those meetings.
Okay. Well, like I said, we will vote on this. We'll set up a schedule in December at our December RAC meeting. We'll decide on where our schedule and locations for the next year.
So right now, September will be,
Let me look at my
Here.
calendar, Tammy.
that, I just care what the next meeting is.
Okay,
why I
what's
put
the
it on
date
my
of our next
September
meeting?
7th.
September 7th. Right now, we've got September 7th for Richfield. We can change that.
If that,
November, our November meeting is, we've got this, okay, right now we're just alternating back and forth. September in Richfield, November in Cedar City, December in Richfield. We just alternated one to the other. If you'd rather have them all here, I'm fine with that. Berlin may feel otherwise.
Of course he does.
Not necessarily care for the meeting in Richfield in December.
Going over I-70?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, somebody's coming over I-70,
Yeah,
whether it's here or in
somebody's coming that way
Richfield,
no
right?
matter what.
There's somebody doing it either way. So right now we had 4 left. We have 2 in Cedar and 2 in Richfield. Unless somebody feels strongly otherwise, we'll stick with that. So you can see both venues and what kind of public participation we get, whether we're in Cedar and Richfield. Let's split them evenly right now would be my proposal. And then if we get information or see something that makes us think one's better than the other over the next 4 meetings, then we'll make a change in December.
do we want to tackle the time? That's been an ongoing,
No, I like to keep Stacy on her toes.
so leave it at 7 next time. Richfield at 7.
So
In November,
we should discuss that.
I think you can move it up a little bit in November.
No, this
Or
is September.
September, yeah.
September, the
is-
proposal is, right now, we have Richfield at 7 PM would be the plan on September 7th.
Is everybody okay with 7? Or do we want, I mean, we've been earlier this last year. 6 or,
Six would be better, right?
can we just set 6 as our standard for the southern region? And I can tell Stacy they're all going to be at 6 o'clock
I like that.
because,
Yeah.
because I'm a little afraid of her.
Sure you are.
All right. 6 o'clock will be the standard time for the southern region and we'll continue to move all over the place.
So we do have authority to do that, right?
Well, not all over the place. We'll move between Cedar City and Richfield. So
Sounds good. That sounds good. Thank you. I don't think there's anything else. With that, we'll adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
we need to get your mallet back.
I know.